Good evening, I'm Rohit Gandhi and you're watching Gravitas. Today, we're going to look at what happens to children of war. To get a sense of the impact of war on children, we will look at Aleppo. It was 4 years ago that Islamic terrorists captured Aleppo and the Syrian forces had to flee. The Islamic groups had the tacit backing of countries like the US, Saudi Arabia, Turkey and Qatar. But now, after intense fighting, it has been liberated and back in the hands of the Syrian government. The focus is firmly back on the suffering of children. The trauma that children of war face leaves the world community responsible for their state. But in the Middle East, children become very much part of the propaganda. Tonight on Gravitas, we look at the issue of children through a story that has drawn a lot of attention. There isn't one side of the story. It's a story of social media campaigns of groups using children to justify their actions.
According to the New York Times report, among the roughly 2.5 million people trapped in Aleppo, there were 1 million children caught in the crossfire between the Syrian forces and Al-Qaeda-linked jihadi groups. 5-year-old Omran Dakhnish was pulled out of the rubble of an airstrike earlier this year. Pictures of the boy, bruised and traumatized by his experience, stunned and shocked the world, and underscored the horrific reality of a war happening in homes and across neighborhoods. This was the image that the world saw. There were many more pictures that the world did not see, but were circulated in closed social media groups by doctors in the region. As the battle for Aleppo reached its inevitable end, images of shell-shocked children, many badly injured, and of lifeless forms bundled for burial seeped through the international media. Medicines had dried up, as did food supplies. Doctors had to abandon injured children to die hospital floors, as there was no way to treat them. With their childhood lost somewhere in the bombings, surviving children face a grim future. Getting back to life anywhere near normal is a distant dream. Bureau Report, WION.
To discuss this, we have with us on the discussion Mr. Mohsin Mughal. He's the executive producer of TRT World. He's a Kashmiri journalist based in Istanbul at the moment. Also joining us is our West Asia Bureau Chief, Anchal Vora. Also joining us is Daniel Epagani. With his inputs, he was earlier in the year in north of Iraq and in the Kurd areas. Let's get a sense of what's happening there on the ground. Mohsin, if you can start, you've been there for over a year and a half in Turkey. Give us a sense of what is really happening on the ground there.
Well, Turkey is now actually hosting the largest number of refugees. And I'll come back to children in a bit. It's basically hosting around, I should say, 3.5 million refugees at the moment, which is the largest number ever, without a lot of support from international community practically on the ground. We've known that the European Union promised $3.5 billion US dollars, which the government here says not all of it has arrived. And of course, the internal domestic estimates suggest that around 12 billion have already been spent, with 25 billion more in the pipeline. And these are only the amount that is accounted for at the moment. So on the ground, this country is actually the threshold which has opened its doors to all the refugees, including children, accompanied and unaccompanied, and housing them as much as they can. That is one question. But there is also a lot of alarm amongst the thinkers, the analysts, about what happens to children who are directly impacted because of conflict. We have seen victims, but we have also seen children being victimized in other ways, not just being at the receiving end of violence, but being forced into violence, but being forced into participating with these violent groups. I can draw your attention to a very recently released HRW report, which actually gave some interesting numbers, Rohit. If I'm to just take a quick look on them, this report was released as early as December 21st, not that far ahead.
What does it say, Mohsen? Because let's get to the crux of the report, and then let's come back to talking about Bana, because certainly she's drawn a lot of world attention, she's drawn a lot of media attention, and we want to go back to that story. What is the crux of this report?
Well, the highlights. The group has documented 29 cases in northern Iraq in which the Kurdish and Yazidi children were recruited by two arms groups, which are basically offshoots of the terror group PKK. Of course, you know that this report talks about these children are mostly under 15, and there has been a lot of hue and cry about the organizations pushing them. The government's actually asking and trying to push these organizations.
And what about Islamic State backed by Turkey, backed by the US, backed by Qatar and Saudi Arabia? Is IS responsible for anything, or are they all above board?
Well, absolutely. There are figures that suggest IS has actually been on the forefront as well. You've seen those videos. You've seen videos which have actually given a lot of alarm across the globe, where you've seen young boys as young as 12 years, even under 12, actually claiming their allegiance and announcing their allegiance to Daesh. There is a rough estimate of about 2,000 recruits which Daesh has recruited overall. Actually, again, a big number. Between January 2011 to June 2015, the figures presented according to the UNGA in their last report, which is actually recorded figures between January and December 2015. In Iraq only, Daesh has actually recruited about 174 children, and these were only in areas of Anbar and Nenawa governorates in Iraq. So you can imagine the magnitude.
The scale is massive, Mohsen. Absolutely, the scale is absolutely massive. Daniele Pagani, our correspondent, was in Mosul just a few weeks ago. He met with the PKK. Let me go back and ask him, Daniele, when you were there and you interviewed the PKK, explain to us what they told you and what their perspective was on this. They are described as a terrorist group by Turkey. Explain to us what their perspective is.
Yeah, I met them on the Kandil Mountains, where they have their headquarters, the mountains bordering Iran on the northern side of the Iraqi Kurdistan. Obviously, they deny any allegation. They do not consider themselves as a terrorist organization. They consider themselves, and especially the members of the so-called guerrilla, the army that they have, as a necessary institution, because they accuse Turkey from their side to force them to live in constitutional denial. And I have to say that of the records, I asked them if it was true that there was the possibility that they had children fighting within their ranks, and they strongly denied it, obviously. So this report is contradictory. We have to see where I have been and the places I have visited. I have seen only members who were obviously more than 18 years old. At least they were looking clearly more than 18 years old.
It's, you know, it's a very challenging war in the Middle East. There are literally millions of people involved in the fighting. Also, the challenge in Middle East is there are too many groups and too many sides. Thank you, Daniele. I'm going to go to Anshul now. Let's take a look at one of the stories she's filed. For over 5 years, Syria has seen war, the worst of terrorism and a severe humanitarian crisis. More than 8 million children are in need of help, and one of them has been called Bana. She's been tweeting about the reality of war. She's been giving millions of other children a voice. While she has had huge support, there is tremendous mistrust between Syria and Turkey, and the very fact that Bana started giving the messages out of Syria when she started out, and now she is in Turkey. WION's West Asia Bureau Chief Anchal Vora has this report.
Hello, my friend Ronaldo. I love football so much. I am a fan of you. From Syria, I love you.
Hello. 7-year-old Bana has won millions of hearts. Tweeting on the war in Syria, her innocent words have brought a war thousands of kilometers away home. This Christmas, Bana wishes for a T-shirt of and from her favorite footballer, Ronaldo Cristiano.
Stand with Aleppo.
But the trolls on Twitter aren't even sparing a child. Like this one says, now she's in paradise trying to take from those in hell. Another one even more hateful. Don't fall for it, her dad is a terrorist that kills Syrian children. She's a fake. You met with the president of Turkey, you're safe, and I'm sure there are more needy kids who need that T-shirt. Despite such hateful tweets, thankfully there are enough supporters of Bana online. Bana is now in Turkey and has met President Erdogan. Syrians who blamed Turkey for supporting ISIS and other terror groups accuse Erdogan of using Bana for publicity and Bana for being a marketing tool. But Bana hasn't been alone in her war against hate. According to UNICEF, 8.4 million Syrian children are in need of immediate humanitarian aid. Millions have witnessed brutal violence that began more than 5 years ago. 50% of those displaced are children. 2.6 million are no longer in school. 2.5 million are either living as refugees or are on a run in search of safety. Bana has been tweeting along with her mother. So many have questioned whose views really were being represented in those tweets. Nonetheless, the young child has managed to reach out to many far away. Bana is out of Aleppo, but many Syrian children continue to brave the winter and the war. And they're hoping for safety this Christmas. In Beirut, Anchal Vora, WION.
It's a story that doesn't see an end. There are tremendous more stories around the story of Bana, but let's go over to Anchal. Anchal, with the story of Bana, what are you hearing in Beirut? What do people have to tell you about the story of Bana?
You know, the story of Bana is quite linked to the story of the region, I would say, Rohit. It depends on who you speak to, you'd hear a different account. There are a lot of people who continue to call her a fake and say her father is an ISIS terrorist, though they're not producing any substantial proof. Though there is enough out there that sort of goes on to show that Bana was taking substantial help. She's only 7 years old, so she was taking substantial help from her mother on what to tweet or what not to tweet. As I do bring out in that story that there is a question over whose views are being presented. When a child speaks to you, and whichever medium a child uses, of course, and as it should, does carry a certain emotionality to it, and it reaches as far away as India and many other faraway parts of this world. That is important because it carries a certain message. That's not to say you and I cannot, sitting wherever we are, I in Beirut and you in India, cannot decide how much truth really there is to that, because this war, to quite a large extent, has been a propaganda war. And one of the reasons of that is how the social media has been used. And the other, the journalists this time around have had very limited, very restricted access, that because of how ISIS has operated. It's not been really a war that we've seen even in Afghanistan, where even the Mujahideen in those years would give you a certain amount of access. During ISIS time, journalists have had very little access. So really the truth is, depending on who you speak to, and very difficult to ascertain, we should be careful of speculation. Though I would like to, considering that this debate was going in a certain direction on Turkey and how the larger war is linked to Bana and children like her, I would like to quote something from a very known political expert of this region, Patrick Coburn. He's been writing for The Independent in his book, which is called The Rise of Islamic State, and he quotes nobody else but the Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden. He spoke at the Harvard University and said, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the UAE were so determined to take down Assad and essentially have a proxy Sunni-Shia war. What did they do? They poured hundreds of millions of dollars and tens of thousands of tons of weapons into anyone who would fight against Assad, except that the people who were being supplied were al-Nusra and al-Qaeda and the extremist elements of jihadis coming from the other parts of the world. So there is this dimension to it as well. I think one of our panelists from Turkey was talking about how Turkey has the biggest number of refugees. Having said that, in Lebanon, there are over 1 million refugees, and Germany, as we all know, is also bearing that burden. So while that continues to be the story, the fact of the matter is here, who you speak to, you know, it really depends on what the truth is.
All right. Thank you very much, Anshul, for that perspective. As parents, or as human beings, you know, children suffer. It's a curse, really. But the story out of Syria is not all black and white. It is a story of billions of dollars of oil, gas, and countries posturing. A Canadian journalist, Eva Bartlett, reporting for Russia Today, it's a show called In the Now, gives us a different perspective on the stories of Aleppo residents and on the story of 7-year-old Bana. Let's take a look.
Final messages are flying out of Aleppo, Syria. They're taking social media by storm simultaneously. It almost looks like a coordinated PR campaign.
No place now to go. It's the last place.
This may be my last video.
This might be close to, if not the last communication.
It's the last time that I talked to you.
It's almost as if they were hoping these final messages would trend and get picked up by mainstream media.
Bombs are everywhere. People are running. They don't know where, just running.
We are here living a genocide, literally.
People are executed. It's as simple as that.
It's almost like these are just innocent civilians with no message, no strategy, no politics, just people simply fighting for their lives. One day, saying goodbye to the world on social media, the next day giving interviews to BBC, CNN, and Al Jazeera, all in prime time. Well, they're not. These are activists. Some of them just recently joined Twitter and clearly support the revolution. They have thousands of followers. Some call themselves journalists and are verified on Facebook, like Bilal Abdul Karim, an American who has no problem pushing al-Nusra propaganda. You know, the rebels. This guy is a member of the White Helmets, who were founded by a British ex-military officer and have been funded with millions by the US and UK. And then there's a little girl named Bana, also joined Twitter not so long ago, in September. She's already verified and has over 200,000 followers. Bana is 7 years old and tweets in perfect English from the heart of East Aleppo with a little help from her mommy. She, of course, also had a final message just in time. So what do all of these people have in common? They want you to think there's one side to this story, one truth, that Assad is randomly going from city to city and killing his own people for some crazy reason with the help of Russia, even though the whole world is watching every step. They want you to think that these civilians pouring out of Aleppo are running from genocide committed by the Syrian army, and those who celebrate on the streets are dancing on children's graves, while al-Qaeda-infiltrated rebels are bravely and heroically defending civilians in East Aleppo. The question is, do you buy it? Because millions of people do.
Mohsen, you've seen that video, I'm sure, living in Turkey. Explain to us the whole perspective. How does, you know, a small 7-year-old living in a small town in Aleppo, you know, make this journey through social media to sitting on the lap of the president of Turkey, Erdogan? Is there a connection? Is this propaganda, or is this just happening, you know, just organically on its own?
Well, I think, look, I just want to clarify a few things which went on in one of your reports as well, which, as your reporter from Beirut said, that nothing in Syria is black and white, and so is the fact that we cannot say that any particular country has actually supported Daesh. Turkey, for example, has been a victim of terrorism, and Daesh has carried out a lot of attacks in Turkey. I would leave that discussion there, but I would go back to your question. Bana, which has not been reported, this 7-year-old girl, or younger than that, sitting in her mother's lap, not even being able to speak English properly. How can she write all these tweets? There's a clear disclaimer written at the top of her account that it's her mother who's engaging, who's writing those tweets, and it's just the face of the girl that she's using.
Sure.
Now, that is to generate an impact which the people of Aleppo had been trying to generate, just to create and draw more attention, which they have succeeded and quite well deserved from the international community. I'm sure you will not disagree that this 7-year-old girl, whose mother we as a network spoke to when she got here, her mother is quite fluent in English. She knows the lay of the land. She's been there. She's born there. She knows the entire neighborhood. So it's quite. I would say it's quite not right to say that how could a 7-year-old tweet.
No, I don't think that's the question. I think the question really the world is asking is how she made her journey to Istanbul that quickly, and how has this unfolded?
Yeah, I think what you need to, what we all need to understand is forget the political lineages, forget the political slants. The fact of the matter is that Turkey has taken forward a big leap in terms of humanitarian efforts that it has made. Now, as a result of that, Bana, who rather became a face of it in the last couple of months, was actually brought in, as were many other refugees brought in, and this face was actually got an opportunity to meet the president of this country, and that's what it is. Now, we've got presidents and leaders of different countries taking pictures with refugees, welcoming them at the airports, going out and speaking to them in their camps, in their homes, in dormitories, and that's televised. I don't think there is any need to further question why this was taken or see any negative impact.
I'm with you. Mohsen, I'm with you. Can never question a 7-year-old, and we shouldn't. I remember a few years ago, covering a story. In fact, one of our reporters had covered a story in Albania, and the girl had described that her sister had been raped and killed. The Canadian Parliament took notice of that and decided to deploy its soldiers, only months later to find out that the reporter who had gone and spoken to the girl told our correspondent back again that she'd lied. And when that happened, the reporter filed that story again saying, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. The girl told me my sister was raped and killed, but it was too late. The Canadian military had already deployed. So certainly we must absolutely be careful as journalists as we watch these stories. While there can be no denying the tragedy of the conflict in Syria, and social media was flooded with gruesome images of children caught in the war, it appears some of the images may have been carefully dressed up to make a political or a humanitarian point. The result is innocence becoming propaganda pawns.
It is said that pictures say 1,000 words and convey emotions like no other. 3-year-old Alan Kurdi's lifeless body on the shore of a Turkish resort hammered home the desperation of thousands seeking escape and sanctuary from their battered nation. 5-year-old Omran Dakhnish, rescued after an airstrike in Aleppo, was another shocker. And now, 7-year-old Bana Alabed, with her tweet, became a poster girl for the suffering of civilians in Aleppo. These images were stark and often captured the soul of the story, which is probably why there have been reports of images of suffering and tragedies being faked. There were reports recently that the Egyptian authorities arrested a man who was about to put out pictures of supposedly wounded children to keep the international focus on Aleppo. Such pictures are indicative of conflicting and vested interest at play, and the modus operandi includes using children as a tool for propaganda to articulate the opinion of one or the other side. Last week, Turkey's president was seen with Bana Alabed. Video carefully capturing his bare hug of the little girl, although
The words exchanged were not audible. Clearly, it is a case of children finding an instant connect and using them as symbols to reach a wider audience. Bureau Report, WION.
We'll give you more perspective on that story, but after the break. But joining us on this to talk about the story is Dmitry Babic. He's joining us from Moscow and works for Sputnik. So stay with us and let's talk a bit more about what really happens in Syria and what happens in this war propaganda. We've been watching the story of 7-year-old Bana and the story of how children are used for propaganda in the war in Syria and around the world. Joining us to continue this discussion is Dmitry Babic. Dmitry is based out of Moscow. He works for Sputnik. Also joining us is Mohsin Mughal. He works for TRT World. It's a news network out of Turkey. Also joining us is Daniele Pagani. He's a correspondent. He was in north of Iraq, in the Kurdish area just a few weeks ago. Let's go to you, Dmitry, first. As you see the story of Bana, the 7-year-old Syrian girl from Aleppo coming out, what do you make of it? I saw the Russia Today story by Eva Bartlett describing it as a fake story.
Well, I didn't work on this RT story, so I don't know all the details. What I can say is that I would not believe the images when you have the leader of the country just supposedly randomly picking up a child and saving the child. You know, this story of a big giant saving children, it's old, it's emotional, but don't believe anything that is too emotional. That is my slogan. However, I would like to say that I think Turkey has made a great progress in its attitude towards its neighbor Syria in the last maybe 1 year or maybe 2 years, because I think right now Turkey behaves in a different, much more responsible way than in the beginning. It seems to me that the Turkish leadership has abandoned the policy of regime change in Syria. I think that any policy of regime change anywhere in the world is wrong because, you know, why do we have sovereign countries? Simply because it is very difficult for another nation without knowing the language, or even knowing the language but not knowing all the peculiarities of another country. It's simply impossible to rule it. And I think that Mr. Erdogan has made a great progress in the last few months, I would say.
Great.
He changed his attitude, and that is the main news.
Right. Dmitry, let me come back to you. Mohsin, do you want to respond to that? Dmitry says that the story, which is so emotional and overly emotional, cannot be believed. How would you respond to that?
Well, I would say, look, that's his opinion, and I can't obviously change anybody's opinion, but it's not necessarily correct that an opinion can be a fact, as is most of the times the case. But I just wanted to draw your attention to the big question, Rohit, that we are discussing here is children who are forced into violence, who become victims of violence, not by just being at the receiving end, but are forced into participating with these violent groups. I think the bigger question at this moment that the world is faced with is we have seen Bal Senas in Naxalite regions in India as well. We've seen the FARC as bringing in young adults and even teenagers into their fold as well. But now the dimension has changed. Children are being used as tools of terrorist propaganda. That's what Daesh has done. That's what PKK has done. I just want to bring to attention one very important thing. In situations like Syria and Iraq, which have basically become a violent quagmire a violent quagmire which is spilled over different countries, various countries, impact, economical impact, migration, refugees. Different states have been backing different groups. which includes supply of arms as well and moral backing as well. But these states are indirectly basically becoming responsible for forcing these children as well into the violence, because they
you're
are
absolutely
supporting
right,
those
Mohsen. Mohsen, you're absolutely
that are
right.
promoting and forcing
You're absolutely
children.
right. The challenge is, how does the world, take a view of this without actually beginning to question it? And that's one of the bigger challenges. Also, oil's the big one out of Iraq, out of Syria, and the larger game. Afghanistan was known to be the great game, but Syria seems to be becoming the greater game. Daniele, do you want to respond to Mohsen? Because you certainly have seen, what's going on the ground from the other side in the Kurdish areas.
Yes, I would like to point out that he's absolutely true when he speaks that children are being used as a terrorist propaganda by Daesh. I would also point out that also Mr. Erdogan used this kid as propaganda for his image in a moment when he's probably a little bit weak, politically speaking, in the country. So we have to look at all the sides of the story. It's not only terrorist organization, but the problem is that right now, today, we see the president of a country that immediately, few days after the liberation, or call it the reconquering or the victory of Eastern Aleppo, managed to have a kid in front of the camera of all the world. And that's a big shot of propaganda also. So we have to point out all the problematics involved in this game.
Let me go to you, Dmitry. Russia has certainly been involved, and it's been involved openly, bombing positions in Aleppo, also backing the Syrian government and backing Bashar al-Assad. Explain to me what the schematics of this. What is Russia's sense on why they need to back Assad?
Well, if you don't believe the mainstream press in the West, if you look to the source, if you look at the source, the statements of the Russian president, of the Russian foreign ministry, they never said that we back Bashar al-Assad. There was actually a lot of criticism of Bashar al-Assad in the Russian media and even in the statements of our foreign minister since 2011. Assad was criticized for, having deficits of democracy in his country before the civil war started. Of course, it's very difficult to talk about democracy when you have a civil war. The reason why Russia decided to support the Syrian government when it was threatened by basically destruction in September 2015, so Russia got involved at least 3 years later than the Western countries. The Western countries have been bombing Syria and northern Iraq for 11 months before Russia got involved. The reason was simply Damascus was under direct threat at that moment. If Mr. Assad and his army had collapsed in 2013 under the threat of American bombing, or in 2015, it is clear that the Islamists would have won. Even the New York Times reported in several, I would say, more or less objective reports that basically, if you look at the opposition forces, the Islamists are the most organized, the most battle-ready, the best armed part of the anti-Assad opposition. So when Russia got involved in Syria, it was not to prop up just one person. It was, of course, yes, to save the minorities in Syria, to save the Christians, to save the Alawites, to save the middle-class Sunnis, who were also threatened by the Islamists in Syria. But of course, there was also, I would say, a more pragmatic consideration for Russia. Russia does not want to have an Islamist state near its border in Syria or in Iraq. We had a terrible experience of the Chechen terrorist activity, I would say not Chechen, but Islamist terrorist activity on the territory of Chechnya for 10 years, since 1994 until 2004. And the terrorist activity ended only when, I'm sorry, Saudi Arabia stopped financing, certain groups in Saudi Arabia stopped financing the terrorists in North Caucasus. So what we want is to prevent the possibility of something like that repeating itself with the so-called Islamic State in Syria and Iraq.
Dmitry, I certainly take your point on why Russia had to intervene. Let's go back to Mohsen. Mohsen, Turkey continued to buy a tremendous amount of oil from the Islamic State in the last few years. Explain to me, why did Turkey think it was essential to buy oil from the Islamic State?
Well, to be honest, I don't think I'm in a position to answer that question, because as much as I know, it has not been proven for a fact that this country has been involved in buying or having any trade links with that terror organization. But what I would like to say is, it is a fact that which I have seen myself living in this country for about a year and a half now, that some of the worst attacks, terrorist attacks, have been carried out by Daesh inside this country, and that continues to be one of the biggest threats, apart from the threats that this country is facing from other terror organizations, which includes PKK. But as my colleague from Moscow, my friend from Moscow said that the immediate need is to find a common ground, and which Turkey and Russia have tried to find in the last couple of months, particularly despite the attack on the Russian ambassador, assassination of the Russian ambassador in Ankara. Both Turkey and Russia went ahead with that collaboration. The very next morning, within a few hours, they actually met and talked about Syria. So there is definitely a positive note there, which can actually ease the humanitarian catastrophe that we are all witness of at the moment. But at the same time, most of the Western world has actually been fence-sitting and haven't proven equally effective as Russia and Turkey have in the Syrian conflict.
What would this take to stop, literally, children suffering this much? What kind of an effort would be required from the world? Can there be a call for a ceasefire? Can the world stop supplying weapons? What needs to happen? Daniele, do you want to take that?
Yes. Well, I think, unfortunately, that right now, since in Syria we undeniably have the presence of both the Islamic State and Jabhat al-Nusra, in order to start speaking about a possible peace, it's mandatory to defeat militarily this organization, because there is, unfortunately, no talking point with them. It's impossible to establish a dialogue, to convince them to stop fighting. It's in their very nature. They survive through fighting, and they regenerate themselves through attacks and war. So the first thing that must be done is to defeat them militarily. Then after that, we can sit down, all the actors can sit down on a table and try to understand how to start a peace process, which needs also to address religion and society and all the actors involved, and maybe also former terrorists who are willing to participate in this peace process.
Thank you, Daniele. While it is predictable for Western interests to paint any picture of the crisis that suits their agenda, the role of the media is up for scrutiny as well. Here's a statement from real journalist Eva Bartlett, a Canadian who describes herself as an independent writer and activist. This is what she said in a speech organized by the Syrian mission to the UN. Channel 4 later denied her claims. Here is the exchange.
Eva Bartlett writes for a blog for the state-funded Russian media outlet Russia Today and is candid about her support for the regime of Bashar al-Assad, who's fighting Syrian rebels with Russian and Iranian help. Western media outlets, including Channel 4 News, frequently broadcast footage supplied by the White Helmets, which purpose to show the aftermath of regime attacks on various rebel-held areas in Syria. Supporters of the Assad regime have variously accused the White Helmets of being puppets of Western powers, peddlers of faked footage, or even terrorist fighters posing as humanitarian workers, all of which the organization vigorously denies.
But what certainly continues to happen is children continue to suffer. There are literally millions of children out there suffering as we speak. From Turkey's end, Mohsen, what is being done to try and stop this catastrophe?
Well, I'll take it from where Daniele left. I think the understanding right now is not to wait for the military intervention to end. There is a very strong opinion, and which is being actioned on the ground as well. There is a parallel chain being created, which is of dialogue. and dialogue has always been the way forward. So there is a lot of engagement being encouraged between the various parties. Russia, Iran, Turkey have already spoken on the ground. As far as I know, there are lots of Turkish organizations which are reaching out to for humanitarian help. Camps have been set up on the Turkish border with Syria as well, where the re-engagement is being looked upon. Children who have just come out from a war zone are being being given psychological counseling. They're trying to bring them back to schools. These children are in a state of shock. They're really afraid of going even a few meters away from their parents because they have seen that, they've lived that horror in Syria. So it's going to take a lot of time to bring all these children out of that psychological shock. And remember, these children are going to grow up as disturbed adults. So that's a big challenge. It's not just a challenge for the next 2 or 3 years. It's the challenge for us, for the world community, to take care of this whole generation, which will be in their teens a few years later, maybe in their youth a few years later, and we have to save them, stop them from growing up as disturbed adults, which can actually become a greater threat for the world community of just a few years down the line from now. No matter whether it's peace or whether the situation in Syria is peaceful or not.
Dimitri, at the end of the 2001 war in Afghanistan, as the Northern Alliance and the American forces took over from the Taliban, most of the Taliban in Afghanistan escaped into Pakistan. Today, what we see is most of the Daesh fighters seem to have abandoned these cities and run away. Where have they run to?
Mm-hmm. So you are drawing a parallel between what happened in Afghanistan and what is now going on in Syria. Am I right?
Absolutely. I'm trying to see if there is a parallel or there isn't. So I'd like to, if you have any perspective on it, I'd love to listen to it.
Well, I agree with you that there are lots of parallels between Afghanistan and Syria. I would say that maybe the difference is that Afghanistan started during the time of the Cold War. So there were basically mistakes and crimes committed on both sides by the Soviet leadership, which sort of gave in to the provocation. I know from many interviews with the former Soviet diplomats and military people that the Soviet Union was afraid that the United States would move into Afghanistan from Pakistan, and that would create a danger for the Soviet Union in the south. So that was a terrible mistake, which little by little grew into a crime. There were also crimes committed, of course, on the Islamist side, which was supported at the time by the United States and by many European countries. Later on, the monsters fed by the United States, including Osama bin Laden and others, turned against their former masters. And I think that is the main lesson that the Western world could learn from Afghanistan. It is that you should not expect the terrorists to be grateful. Don't expect them not to bite you simply because at a certain period you helped them financially, you armed them, and you trained them. They're not going to be grateful for that. With Syria, I think the story was different from Afghanistan in the sense that the initiative for the regime change came from the West and the West alone. If the West had not intervened, together with the Saudis, of course, and with the Qataris, if they had not intervened in Syria, I think Russia and Iran would simply not remember about Syria. Syria was very low on Russia's priority list until, I would say, 2012, 2013, when the danger of regime change around the world became apparent. So I agree with you that there are many parallels between Afghanistan and Syria, but still these are different cases. Unfortunately, with Syria, the tragedy is taking place much closer to the civilizational centers of the world, and the danger is, I think, greater because great powers are involved directly, and there is a danger of a clash inside Syria, a real military clash between big powers. In Afghanistan, that clash was only very indirect and not so dangerous.
You know, South Asia is heavily involved in the Middle East. There are over 8 million people of South Asian descent who live in Syria. 60–70% of the oil in South Asia comes from the Middle East, and over $54 billion of remittances come from the Middle East. So South Asia is heavily interested. The question I want to continue asking, and I want to ask this to Mohsen. Mohsen, where have the fighters gone? Can you shed any light on that?
Well, that is one of the major concerns. Where these fighters, if at all, some survive, where they will be, and that's a big question, and that's what Russia and Turkey are trying to think about at the moment, because Turkey is going to be the first country in the neighborhood which will probably see a lot of threat on that front as well. That's why I said it is a lot of impact. It has a lot of impact on Turkey as and when the war ends. But it remains to be seen how the situation develops. We'll have to see how and to what extent the compromises are made on the ground in Syria. What happens? How much of success does the regime see? The Syrian regime see in Syria itself? So I think it is a very valid question, but I'm afraid not many people will have exact answers on that.
On the end of the fight in Afghanistan, in Kunduz, multiple aeroplanes escaped Kunduz and were told to be landing in Pakistan. The Americans later confirmed that. Also, a lot of the Taliban escaped through Kabul by land route into Pakistan. Pakistan, since 2001, has seen an upsurge of violence and terrorism in their country, and they've seen what could happen if you allow terrorists back in. Let's go to Daniele. Daniele, redrawing of lines, is that going to happen more peacefully going into the future, and will the children not suffer as much as they've suffered so far?
Hopefully. What I can say that what we can hope is that I still believe that a military victory against this organization in the Middle East or Western Asia is mandatory. There is no possibility to stop this process without winning and defeating this organization. But that's not the only point, because after that we have to rebuild the social fabric of a land which has been witnessing war for more than 10 years now, and there will be the challenge. So it's a very complicated moment. There is the chance of peace once and for all, but there is also the chance of events descending into chaos. It will depend on how the state and non-state actors will behave in the coming months or maybe years.
Closing thoughts from you, Mohsen?
I think with all, I think one of the major responsibilities is to report this story with a touch of humanity. I think it is important for everybody, particularly in our fraternity, to see the human angle of the story more than the political angle, and that's how the stories of these young children who are suffering, who are at the receiving end of this war, are going to be reported, and that's probably what will shake the world community out of its slumber. I think it is the way forward. We report on those stories, the human stories, and which might probably push us into peaceful times.
Dimitri, closing thoughts from you in how these children are going to be saved going into the future, and how do we avoid these conflicts, especially in the Middle East?
Well, I think that the tragedies of children should be covered. And there are certain situations when even given a kind of high-profile coverage to individual stories of children, even with children meeting politicians, there are certain situations when it makes sense, because there is a difference between propaganda and reflecting dramatic reality. There are situations when reality looks so dramatic that its coverage looks like propaganda. But here, I think everything depends on the journalist, on his honesty, on his or her integrity. We should all remember that whatever you cover, whatever the facts that you see, don't try to whitewash the terrorists, especially the so-called radicals. You know, they are not radicals, they are murderers if they use the kind of violence that we have seen in Syria on the side of the so-called Islamic State and their allies. So, and to the readers and to the TV viewers, I would make an appeal. Be logical. Remember what the mainstream media told you a month ago, 2 months ago, a year ago. Compare and punish the dishonest journalists by lack of your trust and attention. That's what I would advise the TV viewers and the readers to do.
Thank you, Dimitri. You know, way back in Iraq in 2003, we were covering the story of this 4-year-old child. He had a bullet in his head. And what it took for the bullet to be taken out, he had to be flown to Greece. The ambassador, saw the story of this 4-year-old and flew the child out to Athens, got him operated, and the boy now lives back in Iraq. We were very happy to tell that story from the ground. Certainly, children matter the most. Children are our future. But at the same time, wars aren't our future. And what will happen in the Middle East will determine the lives for literally millions of people. If the world needs to be involved, it needs to be involved in making sure that no weapons seep in. The world needs to be involved in making sure that money does not get funded and routed through terrorist organizations. Well, that's all for now. And for more news and updates, check out our digital, mobile, and social media platforms. Thanks for watching, and this is Gravitas.